Thank you. I think, as you know, Dr. Arnold stood in at short notice. So there's quite a lot of overlap between our talks, but I'm going to try to take that and really relate it to our specialty. I was lucky enough to be the chair of the cardiac surgery clinical reference group. I have to admit that these roles are incredibly time-consuming, and actually I felt I wasn't able to commit enough time to this, and actually Danny Keenan is going to take that on. There are an enormous amount of rather bureaucratic emails coming into hundreds of pages that come through your desk in this role. I really think looking forward for the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to be at least a couple of days a week, really, to take on these roles as chairs of CRGs. What's the national strategic direction? So I think you've heard that commissioning of prescribed services will become the responsibility of the NHS Commissioning Board from 13 days' time. Those services will be delivered on behalf of the board by 10 nominated local area teams. I've not seen the names of the chairs of those or the constitutions of those, and as far as I know, they are not yet in existence. The overriding objective, as I alluded to earlier on, I think is laudable, that the commissioning and provision of prescribed services is organised to provide the best possible patient outcomes, but also in a way that avoids any organisational or geographical variation. And I think we're all aware of the geographical variation that perhaps most recently has existed in the provision of TAVI, where Brompton looks after an area where if you lived on one side of the street, you could have TAVI. If you lived on the other side of the street, there was no TAVI funded. And that clearly is a ridiculous situation to exist in a National Health Service. Just to give you some flavour of who the lead people are, James Palmer is a neurosurgeon who is the programme lead for the transition of specialised commissioning. Kate Caston is the programme director. Kate is, it's a shame Kate's not here. She's been heavily involved in the cardiovascular field and really was probably the commissioner that was responsible in allowing or permitting TAVI to get started in the UK. And Sally Brearley is the chair. And they produced this document, one of a number that I've alluded to, defining how this was all going to happen come the 1st of April. So these again, just to look for a slightly different slant to what Dr. Rana said, are what the arrangements are going to be for specialist commissioning. So the National Health Service Commissioning Board will be directly responsible for national commissioning, and that will be administered through the local area teams. You've seen this slide already. These are the 10 local area teams that you will be engaging in. And I think it'll be interesting in the discussion to see whether anybody has had any engagement yet with their local area team in commissioning activity for cardiac surgery or thoracic surgery from the 1st of April. The Commissioning Board will contract with providers against a single national set of service specifications. So what has happened is the clinical reference groups have been asked to set service specifications outlining standard policies, quality and quantity of services. And to be fair to this organisation, there are somewhere over 60 clinical reference groups, and there are over 130 specialist policies which have been written for that group to consider. And that's leaving aside a vast number of clinical commissioning policies, which is a completely separate area. So I think that probably gives you some flavour of the scale of change that's taking place. And in cardiothoracic surgery, really we have always had specialist commissioning, so the change for us is not that great. But many specialties in the UK are having radical changes in the way that their activities are being commissioned and planned. And I think that a number of the CRGs are having considerable difficulty in coordinating and affecting that transition. So the way this worked was the clinical reference groups produced documentation, service specifications, which contained evidence supporting the service. I think, again, in cardiac surgery, it was very easy, given our excellent data collection, to produce fairly robust numbers of activity and projections. Those policies then went to a clinical advisory group. I think it's an interesting name in that whilst there were some clinicians on it, that not all clinical groups were represented, and there were a large number of commissioners and other, perhaps what you would say, non-practicing clinical staff on that group. That group's job was to look at the policies and make a recommendation, and that recommendation was published online towards the end of last year. It also came out with a clear statement that these policies were written by the clinical reference groups. I think a clear example of how that's not quite true is in the invasive cardiology group, which I was also involved. Now, the cardiology CRG advocated commissioning of a set number of MitraClip implants, PFO closures, left atrial appendage occlusions, to be done in a relatively small number of centres, collecting the data in a very much commissioning by evaluation way. The CAG document stated that there was to be no funding for these services, and that had been recommended by the CRG. As you imagine, that caused quite considerable consternation amongst the members of that CRG and quite a lot of communication with the leaders of this programme. All the services were considered by the CAG and then the National Board according to 4 key principles that were laid out at the start of this process. And these are those 4 key principles. Quality of service and patient outcomes don't seem to figure very much there, but cost does. And I take you back to Dr. Rana's slide about the challenges, and I think that slide focused a lot on cost, productivity, efficiency measures. So I think you're able to read into that whatever you want to about this process. I think this is, again, a laudable aim, that the Commissioning Board will have systems and processes to ensure that there is one national way of evaluating evidence and effectiveness for new interventions and treatments. Again, I think, the discussions that we've had over the years about how to monitor performance and outcomes is going to be quite a challenge to find a single system that will be able to monitor outcomes for the whole diverse range of medical specialties that are going to be commissioned by the Specialist Commissioning Board. So how is it organised underneath this? Basically, there are 5 programmes of care reporting to the Clinical Assurance Group, and each of those has a chair. We feature in this group digestion, renal, hepatobiliary, and circulatory system. The chair of that is a very competent chap, but he's an upper GI surgeon. So when the Clinical Assurance Group met to discuss cardiac, cardiothoracic, cardiovascular issues, there was not a single member of the CAG group who had any clinical cardiovascular knowledge or experience. To be fair, I think the nomenclature of this has now changed to internal medicine after some comments that it perhaps wasn't very accurate. And these are, within this group that we live in, cardiac surgery, there wasn't a thoracic surgery CRG until some of us in the society suggested that actually thoracic surgery also needed to be represented in this process. But these are the sort of rather diverse subgroups which exist in this group. One of the things I've been pushing for fairly hard in this process is I'm not sure that some of these divisions have been thought out very well in terms of looking forward. For example, myocardial revascularization is split between completely separate CRGs. And wouldn't it be more sensible for there to be a commissioning policy for myocardial revascularization rather than a policy for PCI and a policy for coronary artery surgery? Equally, I think there's an increasing merging of interventional cardiology and cardiac surgery, and also vascular surgery and endovascular intervention. And to have these all separated in terms of CRGs and commissioning policies also seems to be a less than ideal situation. So this just goes back to the piece of work that the CAG did, published here and went out to public consultation. And as yet, unless I've missed it, I don't think there has been a final document. Dr. Arno, do you know, has there been a final document produced? Oh, good. So there'll be 3 days in which to implement that before the 1st of April. So that's plenty of time. Providers are encouraged to engage in the forthcoming contract product consultation, which will be used in all prescribed service contracts from the 1st of April. So I'd be very interested to hear how many of you have been involved in these detailed discussions. So this what I've said so far relates to the commissioning of established clinical practice. So how do we deal with innovation? And this is another document from the commissioning board on innovation, health, and wealth, and defines the stages in innovation of invention, adoption, and diffusion. So the commissioning board has decided to set up a specialist services innovation fund. And the idea there is to support activities that will assist the evaluation of a service or new technologies or new devices being implemented in a different way. The fund is not to be used to start using treatments that should be commissioned. And it's also been set up as a grant-giving body. And so your applications to that will take the form of a major grant application. And it's been suggested that will be at a degree and a level compatible with an MRC application. And this is the special SSCIF, as it's called. That's interesting. Somebody's turned my slide into Japanese. This slide, if I can remember, defines the stages of adoption of a new technology. And this, as you can obviously see, says when there's enough evidence for the device to get a CE mark. And down here, obviously, is when there's enough evidence for the device to be commissioned. But there's a big gap here in the middle, i.e. from a device getting a CE mark, which, as you all know, really just means the device says what it does on the tin, but doesn't really provide you with any data as to clinical effectiveness or what patient population it should be used in. And so there's a gap here that the SSCIF is supposed to deal with. And perhaps, in the cardiac surgical field, an obvious device or new system that would fall into that would be sutureless aortic valves. They have a CE mark, but they really don't have enough robust evidence to be commissioned by a National Specialist Commissioning Board. Again, this is somewhat, I think, stalled in terms of its timing, and you see here that there was supposed to be a launch. There was a launch at the CRG meeting in September, but fairly soon after that, there was going to be a sort of a call for applications, and we haven't really got much further 6 months later. This is the process that will oh, crumbs. Yeah. So the process, as you see clearly, is... Actually, it's probably about as clear as the whole process really is, actually. Yeah, anyway, you go through stage 1 to 4, and then you're fine. Stage 1 is an online application that's about a 2-page bullet point box filling in that then gets sent to the chair of the relevant CRG. He has a scoring matrix with which to score the application, and it would be either rejected by him or sent back to the applicants asking them to submit a full application. So a bit like applying to the HTA or something like that. So you have an initial application which needs to be supported by one individual, but ideally would have multiple partners. So you might, for example, want to work with one of the companies to develop sutureless valves, and you would put in a proposal, and the CRG chair would say yes. And then what you would produce is a full-scale grant application, numbers, costs, protocols, etc. That would then go back to the some as yet not quite formulated board who would make a grant body decision. So there is a formulated way, and I have seen these stages. The first stage is a fairly simple process. So what are the sort of criteria for applying to the Specialist Commissioning Board? So the product should have a CE mark. Okay. The target patient group has to fall within the specialised services portfolio, as this is coming from specialised services funding. And innovations should offer the promise of addressing an unmet clinical need or offer some other substantial benefit in terms of patient outcome or service efficiency. Clearly, I've not put all the criteria down, but there's sufficient evidence of the benefits to justify investment through the fund, and insufficient evidence to allow commissioning. The idea, and I've forgotten whether it's 1 or 2%, but 1 or 2% of the budget of the whole National Specialist Commissioning Board will be top sliced to support that fund. Now, that might sound like quite a lot of money, but you have to remember that all of the 60-odd CRGs will be bidding for projects through this fund. So, returning to where we are today, I think that if we're hoping to achieve that, I think there's still a little bit of a mountain to climb between now and the 1st of April. Thank you very much.